And welcome back to Bossing Food Challenges with Mr. F, because if someone like Beard Meets Food can get all the hits on YouTube, why not me? Only kidding. Of course, it's A-level, OCR, Paper 2, Section B, Dystopian Literature, but if you've studied other texts, Gothic, American, etc., the skills still apply, so it could still be useful to you. Okay, the tricky one about this is that it's AO3 heavy. AO3 is context, the times in which texts were written and received. So we could be maybe thinking of that as leading with the context and then pinning that or mapping that to the text, or you can do it the other way around. You can talk about the text and then map that, pin that to the context that surrounds it. But we always need to be thinking about the authors, when they were writing, why they were writing, what was going on around the time they were writing, and how that is being received at the time it was written, and also for later readers such as ourselves. At the same time, we need to constantly be switching between texts. It's a comparative essay, so we need to be thinking about similarities and differences and pivoting between text A and text B. And of course, we need to think about different interpretations of the text. And this is a very broad AO. So it can be, we tend to think of this as critical comments and film versions, or for example, with The Handmaid's Tale, the HBO TV version would be relevant, and how that's maybe treated differently from the source material, from the text it's based on, and of course then why it's treated differently, how they've adapted it for a new audience, a new time. You know, you need to engage with that and think about why it's been changed from the source text. But that can also be your own interpretations, or, you know, I've seen it said that your interpretations of other people in your class would be relevant. So it is quite generous and broad. Of course, there are more wider interpretive approaches, such as psychoanalytic, Marxist, feminist readings as well would be really relevant here as well. Critical comment, likewise, you need to engage with that. It's not enough just to dump something in there that A.C. Bradley said. That's a famous Shakespearean critic, so he wouldn't be talking about The Handmaid's Tale in 1984, but maybe, say, Christopher Hitchens, who was a big fan of Orwell, might have something to say about 1984. But you need to engage with that. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Does it support your argument? Are you challenging that? So engage with that critical comment in some way. And finally, whoops, check this bad boy out. You can see I'm a bit rusty. Let's do some live editing. That should be AO1, shouldn't it? There we are. AO1 is your argument that you're going to construct from the get-go. Hopefully you'll have that kind of thesis statement outlined in relation to the question that you're answering in the introduction, and then you're just kind of demonstrating that thesis statement, engaging with it all the way through to give a coherent and well-structured argument. It also includes terminology and critical concepts as well. So, that will take care of itself. When you kind of zoom in on the text and analyze it, that will be, that's annoying, isn't it? Go away. That will be doing that. That will take care of itself. You're going to need to use short details like Down with Big Brother from Winston's Diary, or alternatively for The Handmaid's Tale, that might be some of those biblical greetings, blessed be the fruit, may the Lord open, that the handmaids use. It might be the use of patronymics for their names, Offred, Offglen, or it might be some of the portmanteau words, the compound words that are created by Atwood here, such as particicution and praevaganza. Short quotes is all we need to do to support that. One last point before we move on. AO3 can include other dystopian texts. So obviously today I'm going to be using The Handmaid's Tale in 1984. The reason being that's what I've taught, and That gives you access to all three questions, so it's quite nice to give you a bit more freedom there to choose a question that you're comfortable with. But say you've read Brave New World or The Road or The Drowned World, you could bring that in as AO3, talking about dystopian texts in general, or as a they don't like you to bring in other texts in a comparative sense. So you might want to use that just in a contextual sense rather than a comparative sense. They like it to be two texts because that gives you more opportunities for deeper comparison. So just be mindful of that. All right, let's have a look. So we're not going to zoom in on this first question too much, but it's just to show you the approach that I would recommend taking, which is normally the statement they give you is quite obvious and you probably want to challenge the obvious in some way. Yes, you may agree with it up to a point and you're going to use some evidence to say, well, yes, of course, because X and Y, but actually things are more nuanced than that. And here are some counter examples of where that, too generalized statement comes undone. So here's a good example. Dystopian fiction often hints at a utopian ideal which has gone wrong. And we might agree with that to a degree with The Handmaid's Tale. If we think about it from the view of the historical notes at the end, where we get a more sympathetic view of what Gilead was trying to achieve in the challenging conditions of a declining birth rate and fertility issues. So here was one very radical authoritarian approach to ensuring the survival of the human race by finding a way to procreate, and obviously basing that on a theocratic, creating a theocratic state of Gilead to do that. So it was obviously a regression for female rights and female reproduction rights and equality and many things. But if there was a utopian ideal which fell and became this dystopian ideal for both men and women. We see that men are also trapped in the role, in their roles, and are kind of unhappy even if things benefit them, such as the commander that Offred is with. He seems, you wouldn't call him contented completely with his lot. There we can say, yes, there was a utopian ideal and it's gone wrong because it's obviously having to use violence to enforce things, and there's a lot of disenfranchised people, and clearly it fails ultimately because the historical notes suggest it hasn't endured or survived. So maybe the contradictions of that utopian ideal, so many people were disenfranchised because of it that it's led to the failure there. Dystopian fiction often hints at utopian. Could we say the same thing about 1984, Oceana, Airstrip 1? To me, that just seems more authoritarian, for self-interested, keeping a large percentage of the population, 70%, isn't it? May even be 90, I may be misremembering, check that. Are the proles. You have a tiny part of the population that's the outer party, and then you have the inner party elite who are doing very well. We see O'Brien in comfortable surroundings and having all the power and all the control to vaporize people. So that feels much more totalitarian, fascistic, nefarious, and not in any way utopian, because so many people are disenfranchised from having a comfortable life. Look at even an Alty Party member like Winston is forced to drink the cheap Victory gin and smoke terrible cigarettes and terrible coffee, drink terrible coffee and have terrible food. Struggles to have any kind of meaningful relationship with women, and he's slightly better off than the proles, and maybe actually ironically the proles are the happiest because they're ignorant. But that suggests that there's something very dystopian and not utopian about that society. So that would be a good counterexample for that question. Okay, let's have a look at this question here. Writers of dystopian fiction often delight in inventing new uses of language. And immediately, I think this is one where I may be challenging a bit more the obvious statement, because there's this problematic phrase, often delight. I'm not sure any dystopian writer delights in that. Maybe there's a kind of creative energy that is stimulating for them, but I think for them what we're dealing with here more is necessity. In order to achieve their aims, using their dystopian literature to point out some of the warnings about the present and the possible futures that may result from that present that's maybe going in the wrong direction. It's become necessity to create new language to highlight maybe authoritarianism or technological dystopias or ecological dystopias. A new language is required, but it's a necessity to illustrate the dystopian genre, the dystopian world that they're creating. There's a lot of world building to add that authenticity, but ultimately to provide maybe some kind of warning to the present about the possible future. And also the other problematic word here is maybe new. We're going to look at 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, and we will see that there definitely are new coinages and new uses. But sometimes these are either reflective of things that are currently extant for George Orwell during the 1940s. This language was something that was happening in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. And for Margaret Atwood, there's a kind of, I wouldn't say regression, but a recall of, the biblical language. So something that's just being repurposed by Atwood for her theocratic state of Gilead. Okay, if I was answering this question, where would I start? Well, we know that we need to... AO3 is dominant, 50%, and we have to constantly map our AO3 onto the text. So we need to... It's not a history essay, so we're mapping the AO3 content onto the text. And there's two ways to do that. We can start with the text and talk about things in the text that answer the question, and then revert back to the surrounding context, when it was written, how it was received by contemporary readers when it was written, and current readers today. So we can do it either way around. Here, for me, language makes me think of Orwell and the BBC. He was at the BBC from 1941 to 43, and there he was exposed to the language of propaganda and the language of bureaucracy, because it was a time of war. It also makes me think of this wonderful quote, and I will link to this essay in the notes below the video. Politics and the English Language, written after the war, or at least published after the war, 1946. And this quote that says, "If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." And there we can see the thinking pre-1984 of the parallels between language and thought, with a view to abuse of power, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, etc. Mapping that to the text, I might think of newspeak, the language being created by the inner party to basically control the way the population thinks. So these are coinages like mini-true for the Ministry of Truth, ingsoc for English socialism. So there would be my little short quotes there to highlight that. But what's interesting is that these coinages is what we might think of as contractions, just means shortening of two words together. Are similar to contractions in the 20th century totalitarian regimes. Nazi is short for National Socialist, and Politburo is short for a long phrase, Committee of the blah blah, a long bureaucratic Soviet phrase, but is shortened down to Politburo. And we see a mimicking of this. So again, that's not new, but it's it is new because the words mini-true and ingsoc don't exist. But it's being really influenced by things he was exposed to as a journalist at the BBC in the 1940s, and the language being used by extant authoritarian regimes in the 1940s. There's also, if you go to the Wikipedia page, something to do with some interesting things about something called Basic English, which is a kind of constructed language that was being mooted at the time in the 1940s when Orwell was at the BBC. And we might think of newspeak as, a kind of deliberately, willfully constructed language with a specific view to corrupting thought, really restricting thought, isn't it, there, and removing ideas like liberty and, freedom, etc. Now, this is slightly different to what Atwood is doing in The Handmaid's Tale. We have biblical language. We talked about that earlier because Gilead is a theocracy. Where's this coming from? Where's the AO3 link there? Well, in the 1980s, you had the Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran, repression of women's rights there. And that was a theocracy where religious law is being used, and we have a kind of religious state, as it were. So that ties in with the time period in which the book was written. So drawing on that, we see this biblical language which is being repurposed in Gilead. Give me children or else I die, blessed be the fruit, where fertility is given primacy. The state basically becomes a way to ensure the survival of the human race through controlled fertility and the handmaids. But we are getting also re-education. So people, the handmaids as they are at present, remember the time pre-Gilead, so they need this re-education, and this language is helping to re-educate them with their traditional greeting. But again, that's not new language, is it? That's old biblical language coming from Genesis in the Bible. We get that with the epigraph, so that's the very first thing into the text. The gateway into the text is that initial epigraph from Rachel. I have it here. About Rachel, sorry. When Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children or else I die. And then we get the references to my maid Bilhah. That's the very first thing that we're reading before we get into the text. So again, it shows us the importance of that biblical language for Gilead and for Atwood. Okay, can I map any AO5 onto that? Yes, I'm going to go with this one for which comes from a very useful podcast in our time on 1984. David Dwan, an academic, who said he is fascinated, he being Orwell, by the way language conditions thought and the way thought can be reconditioned by language. So that ties in perfectly with what's going on now. I forgot to put that in before. Okay, I've got this other point here about prefixes, but I'm going to come back to that because, as you can see, this one is not as developed, is it? I've jotted down some ideas here as well. It's not as developed as my third point, so I'm just going to come back to that because I think you want to have points where you've got more to say, and if I run out of time and I've only got that to squeeze in at the end, that's better than not having fully developed this third point here, which is to do with portmanteau words, which is where new words are created by sandwiching two words together, and both authors are doing this. So this is a nice bit of AO4 where I've done contrast in the kind of bureaucratic language being used in newspeak, where Orwell's influence at the BBC and knowledge of socialism and communism are coming to the fore there, compared to the biblical language being used or repurposed by Atwood. Here, both authors do use portmanteau, but again, for slightly different effects. So examples from the text would be of a 1984 memory hole, doublethink, newspeak, thought crime, and there are others you could have. And this reminds me of, again, it's that kind of bureaucratic language, the language of socialism and communism. And you might remember, Orwell was a lifelong socialist, even, lifelong, but he became a socialist and he never lost his socialist ideals. He dabbled with communism, but during his time in Spain, he kind of faltered and lost faith in the communist project because of the way of the infighting that he saw between the socialists and the communists in Spain. So here, I think in this kind of language, this new creation of language. We can see abuses of language by totalitarian regimes like Stalin, or fascist regimes like in Nazi Germany, and it's got that kind of bureaucratic obscuration we might think of here. These phrases like vaporization, they're hiding the truth, aren't they? So this is all to do with hiding the reality of what you're doing as a regime, and this was what was happening in, like what was it? One possible example would be the final solution. The phrase used by Nazi Germany when they were discussing the extermination of the Jews through concentration camps and mass death. It's a very ambiguous phrase. We have no way of knowing, and this is what historians have struggled with, trying to find proof that this was a planned project. So memory hole, doublethink, newspeak, thought crime, there's something of that in there, isn't there? And we could also find examples from Stalinist Russia as well if we wanted to. My AO5 here might be a link to the film, and I think it's quite interesting. Newspeak is heard repeatedly in the 1984 film version, more immersive for the viewer than in the book, allowing us to experience this reality. So we're constantly getting that used in a kind of quotidian, everyday sense, and that's quite... it adds to that authenticity, the realism of this dystopian world that Orwell's created in the film version. Pivoting across to Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, she also uses portmanteau, particicution, participation and execution sandwiched together, and the idea of, you could explore that a little bit if you wanted to, regarding the way that, this is kind of causing the handmaids to have blood on their hands and to be kind of implicated in the regime itself of Gilead. Pravaganza, that has that really evangelical resonance of mixing prayer and extravaganza, the idea of spectacle, birthmobile, and you will find other examples as well. If I was tying this to AO3 here, I'd probably tie this to the idea of televangelism in the 1980s, Reaganism, the Christian right, traditional values. As a Canadian, Margaret Atwood would be looking with a critical view, which has been pushed to a dystopian extreme of this kind of behaviours, manifesting as they were in the 1980s, and then just pushing that to an extreme to see how far they could go. You might also remember that Serena Joy, the character, the commander's wife, is based on Phyllis Schlafly, a American attorney, conservative activist, author and anti-feminist. Worth looking up and finding out a bit about her, that adds to that kind of, that we could use that in some way. Perhaps here we might also pivot to the way that we know about particicution, pravaganza, and all the language of Gilead is even the ones, Offred's own language as a handmaid, is because of the audio recordings. This is her revenge on Gilead. Language is used as a weapon to document Gilead. And Carol L. Barron has said that Offred's power is in language. It was interesting that, from the very first word to the very last word, they're all Offred's words, and they're Offred's documenting this world. So if we know about this new language, it's because Offred's own ability to remember, recall, and use the language later when she does those recordings is important. Okay, let's come back to that point I skipped over, which was to do with prefixes, which was the use of un. An un-person in 1984, there's something sinister about that. It reminds us of Stalin and the gulags and people being disappeared. You could then tie that to the idea of vaporized. It's another one of those words where someone has been completely extinguished from life, but not just from life, but also from history, and that's what's quite chilling. And the idea, of course, that the dictionary is constantly being revised, things removed, to remove the possibility of thinking about ideas like freedom. So, undoing of language in a way. This is similar as well. Atwood also uses the same prefix to talk about unwomen, those women who were then, expelled from Gilead and sent to the toxic wasteland to clean up, like Offred's mother. And we might think here of her experiences in East Germany. This is where she was when she started to write the novel in 1984. The date is significant because it's the year, the true year of Orwell's 1984, and obviously there would have been anniversaries around that. Czechoslovakia, the USSR, so all these countries were behind the Iron Curtain, under the control of the USSR, and this idea about silence, disappearing, repression would have been in her mind when she was writing this. Now, perhaps even more useful here is a difference, though. So I might then say, well, but also because Atwood, we might argue, or you could argue, that The Handmaid's Tale is a feminist text, then the patronymics, Offred being Offred, is something, again, being repurposed. It's not new, like when we talk about von Goethe, it's the same principle. William's son of William. These are apparent in other languages, in French, in German, in Russian, and in English. But she's using it here to highlight the role that the handmaids are in terms of becoming someone else's property and losing their own name. So again, this is kind of, because she has a specific, maybe feminist goal in mind, you could maybe flesh that out as well, and then you could link that to this AO5. The regime of Gilead is staggeringly misogynistic, and you can make that a language point to do with the patronymics there, and the hierarchy as well, and the different titles that people have: commander's wife, the wives, handmaids. Even the word handmaid is kind of interesting, as it's it's not a new word, is it? But it's just being repurposed, which is, I think, what she's doing throughout. All right, if you did all of that, have I missed anything out here? Yes, I have. I had this one here as another possible AO5, which is for, it's really to do with newspeak. Interestingly, the 1984 film version begins with the incoherent ranting of the 2 minutes hate, which could show how thought has already been corrupted by language. But that could be used there as well, to do with the dictionary removing the possibility of thought, and then instead of nuanced argument, things just get reduced to this kind of incoherent rage being directed at Goldstein. But in the film, it starts with that, which is different from the text, and then that's what's quite interesting, because we see this raging mob and their incoherency, and that might be a product of the way language is being corrupted. All right, if you put all that together, you'd have a pretty solid answer, wouldn't you? All right, so I'll get that uploaded. I'll stick the links in. There's some useful links. I would definitely recommend the Orwell Foundation. Loads of good stuff on there. There's one I'll link to on the BBC, and I'll link to the politics and the English language. I'll link to the Newspeak page on Wikipedia, and then I'll link to the Phyllis Schlafly one as well. I will be back with other things. Might do another Hamlet Unseen Extract. Might do another Hamlet Section B. Probably. All right. Subby sub, likey like, and see you soon. Bye for now.